A young woman driving alone along a quiet rural road when she notices something unusual ahead. A bobcat, impossibly calm, stood in plain view, breaking every rule she thought she understood about predators and people. It didn't flee. It didn't snarl. It walked straight toward her car and tapped on the door, as if asking for something no human was ever meant to give. As the woman stepped out, she realized this wasn't curiosity or chance. It was desperation. It was dying slowly from a hidden trap, and it had chosen her to be its last hope. What follows is a heart-pounding rescue that defies the laws of nature. Stay with this story, because the reason that Bobcat stopped her will blow your mind. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Claire Hargrove had driven that ribbon of country road so many times that her mind usually wandered ahead of her tires, drifting to grocery lists and unpaid bills, and whether her father remembered to take his heart medicine before bed. The pines leaned in close here, old and watchful, and the winter-brown grasses bowed toward the drainage ditch like tired shoulders. There were no billboards, no gas stations, and no houses close enough to lend comfort, just long stretches of quiet broken by the occasional mailbox and the flash of a hawk crossing the sky. She was alone in her little sedan, heater humming, hands warm on the steering wheel, when she saw something that made her foot ease off the accelerator without thinking. Up ahead, where the shoulder widened near a gap in the trees, a shape stood far too still to be a deer and far too bold to be anything that valued its life. At first, it looked like a big house cat that had wandered out of someone's barn, until Claire's eyes adjusted to the proportions that did not belong in anyone's living room. The legs were longer, the shoulders were higher, the head was broader, crowned with tufted ears that pointed like question marks at the sky. A bobcat, not crouched in the brush, not vanishing like a shadow. Standing in plain view, close enough that she could see the pale spots on its coat and the thick, blunt tail that made it look carved from the woods itself. Claire's breath caught, not from fear at first, but from surprise, because wild cats did not stand like that. They slipped away. They dissolved. They obeyed the oldest rule of survival. Do not trust the road, and never trust the human behind the wheel. This one did neither. The bobcat did not run. Instead, as the car rolled closer, it stepped toward the shoulder as if making room rather than retreating, then turned its head and looked directly at the windshield. The gaze was steady, not feral panic, not the flat stare of a predator deciding distance, but something that looked, unsettlingly, like intention. Claire slowed to a crawl. She kept both hands on the wheel, then flicked her eyes to the rearview mirror, checking for another vehicle that might plow into her if she stopped. The road behind was empty. The road ahead was empty. The woods held its breath. She brought the car to a careful stop, leaving plenty of distance, and let it idle. Her first instinct was the sensible one. Stay inside, do not approach, and call for help. But the cell signal icon on her dashboard display was a lonely slash through the bars, and the only thing the phone could do was reflect her face back at her like a small, worried moon. The bobcat began to walk toward the vehicle. It did not slink, the way cats usually moved when they were trying to be unseen. It walked on purpose, shoulders rolling, claws hidden, tail low. Halfway across the shallow ditch, it paused, then lifted one front paw and placed it against the driver's side door, right where the glass met the frame. The sound was soft, a tap that should not have existed in a world where bobcats belonged to thickets and rabbits, not car doors and human decisions. Claire's stomach tightened. She kept the windows up. She kept the doors locked. She reminded herself that even a hurt wild animal could bite through panic, and rabies did not care about good intentions. The bobcat circled the car once, close enough that Claire could see the whiskers and the pale fur around the muzzle. It lifted its paw again, tapping at the glass with a steady rhythm, then backed away and stood facing her, as if waiting for her to understand something she had not yet learned to read. Only then did Claire notice the way the cat moved. The left side of its body dipped slightly. One hind leg did not carry its full share. The bobcat's breathing was shallow, and it held its belly a fraction too stiff, as if the simple act of drawing air hurt. When it turned, there was a jerk to the motion that looked less like caution and more like pain. "Something's wrong," Claire whispered, and the words fogged the inside of the windshield like a confession. She had grown up around wildlife, the kind of childhood where adults knew which snakes to avoid and which birds meant rain. Her mother, before she passed, had been the kind of woman who stopped for turtles on the road and kept a box of nitrile gloves in the kitchen drawer because you never know what the day will bring. Claire had inherited the gloves and the caution and the trouble of caring too much. But this was different. This was a wild predator standing at her door asking, in the only language it could, for help. Claire's mind raced through every warning she had ever heard. Do not feed it. Do not touch it. Do not corner it. Do not assume it understands kindness. Yet the bobcat remained strangely still, ears forward, eyes not wide with terror but narrowed in a stubborn, pleading focus. Claire reached into the passenger seat and pulled her jacket up around her neck, as if warmth could also protect her from the weight of choice. Then she opened the glove compartment and found what she always kept there. Thick work gloves, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, and a multi-tool she used for everything from tightening a loose screw on her father's porch rail to cutting a stuck seatbelt during a fender bender last summer. She took a slow breath and made herself a rule, clear and firm. She would not do anything reckless. She would not chase the animal. She would not put her hands where teeth could reach. She would do what her mother used to do when the world handed her a problem with claws. She would think, then move carefully. Claire cracked the driver's door open just an inch. Cold air slipped in. The bobcat did not lunge. It did not flee. It stepped back 2 paces, as if granting space, and lowered its head. That tiny retreat made Claire's skin prickle. It looked like understanding. It looked like permission. She opened the door wider and stepped out, keeping the door between her body and the animal like a shield. Her boots sank slightly into the damp shoulder, and the smell of pine resin and wet earth rose around her. She pulled the thick gloves on, flexing her fingers until the leather felt like a second skin. "Easy," she said, voice low as if the trees might startle. "Easy, sweetheart. I'm not going to hurt you." The bobcat's ears flicked at the sound, and it shifted its weight, grimacing in a way that made Claire's chest tighten, because pain looked the same in every creature that carried it alone. Claire kept her distance, angled her body sideways, and avoided direct eye contact the way wildlife handlers taught, so she would not look like a challenge. She extended the jacket in front of her like a soft barrier, not to grab the cat, but to have something between skin and claws if it panicked. The bobcat took 1 step forward, then another, then paused and turned its body slightly. And there it was. Near the lower abdomen, half hidden by mottled fur, something dark and sharp protruded from the skin. It looked like a piece of twisted metal or wire, embedded at an angle that suggested it had not simply scratched the animal, but hooked it, snagging flesh every time the bobcat moved. The area around it was swollen. The fur was clumped, damp, and stained. A trap. Not the clean, legal kind used with permits and checks, but the ugly, careless kind that sat forgotten in the woods like an insult, waiting for any living thing to pay the price. A snare line or a jagged piece of human debris. Either way, it carried the same truth. Something made by people had found its way into an animal's body, and the animal had carried that mistake until it could not carry it anymore. Claire swallowed hard. Her pulse thudded in her throat. She wanted to rush in, to yank it out, to fix it the way she fixed everything in her own life by working harder and sleeping less. But she knew enough to respect the body's fragile math. Pull wrong and you tear tissue. Pull fast and you trigger bleeding. Pull careless and you get bitten, and then no one gets saved. She looked toward the road, then down the long stretch of emptiness. No cars, no houses, no help coming with sirens and tranquilizer darts. Just her, the cold, and a bobcat that had walked straight to her door like fate had chosen a driver at random. Claire took the flashlight from the first aid kit and clicked it on, angling the beam low so it would not blind the cat. She knelt slowly on one knee, careful not to collapse her height too fast, and used the jacket as a soft screen, creating a small wall that guided the bobcat's head away from her hands without cornering it. The bobcat trembled, a shiver that ran from shoulders to tail, and Claire realized it was not only pain, but exhaustion. The animal's muscles quivered like a string pulled too tight. It had been running, dragging this thing, fighting infection, fighting hunger, fighting fear, and somehow it had still found enough resolve to step onto a road and ask a stranger for mercy. Claire slid the multi-tool from her pocket and opened the pliers. The metal looked too small and ordinary to belong in a moment this serious. She spoke again, softly, letting her voice become a steady metronome. Okay, I see it. I'm gonna help. You hold still, and I'll be quick. It was a foolish thing to say to a wild cat, and yet the bobcat did something that made Claire's eyes sting. It eased itself down onto its haunches, then lowered onto its side with a careful, pained slowness, exposing the wound as if offering it. Claire did not move for a heartbeat, because the gesture felt sacred. In wildlife rehab, trust was never demanded, only earned, and even then it arrived like a shy guest. Here it was, placed in front of her with trembling courage. She leaned in just enough to see the object clearly. It was wire, twisted and barbed at one end, like the broken loop of a snare or the jagged remains of fencing. The barbed section was lodged under the skin. Around it, the flesh was inflamed, the body fighting the foreign thing with everything it had. Claire took a moment to plan. She would not pull straight out. The barb would tear. She needed to back it out along the angle it entered, and she needed to minimize movement. She also knew the risk. Infection could already be spreading, and removal was only step one. But if she left it, the wound would worsen. The cat could die slowly, far from this road, and Claire would carry that knowledge like a stone. She placed her jacket closer, not pressing down, just creating a boundary that kept the bobcat's front legs from jerking toward her hands. Then she used the pliers to grip the wire gently, testing resistance with a feather-light tug. The bobcat flinched, a low growl vibrating in its throat, but it did not strike. Claire paused, breathed, and loosened her grip. "I know," she murmured, voice thick. "I know it hurts. Just a little more." She adjusted the pliers again and used the smallest movement she could manage, rocking the wire back and forth in tiny arcs, trying to free the barb from tissue without tearing. Seconds stretched long. The world narrowed to the glint of metal, the rise and fall of the bobcat's ribs, and Claire's own hands trembling despite the gloves. When the wire shifted, Claire felt it through the pliers like a door unlocking. She steadied her breathing, then guided the object back out along the path it had entered, millimeter by millimeter, until suddenly it slid free. The bobcat let out a sound that was not a growl and not a yowl, but a rasping exhale, like a storm letting go. Claire held the wire up, stunned by how small it looked now that it was out, and how huge the suffering it had caused. The end was jagged, cruel. She dropped it into an empty plastic container from her first aid kit so it would not fall back into the grass, another hazard waiting for another body. Blood welled at the wound, not a gush, but enough to make Claire's heart hammer. She did what she knew was safe. She took a sterile gauze pad, pressed it gently against the area to slow bleeding, and kept the pressure steady without poking around or applying ointments that could harm. She poured a small amount of clean bottled water over the fur nearby to rinse away clotted debris, keeping her movements minimal. The bobcat's eyes fluttered half-closed, not in sleep, but in relief so deep it looked like surrender. Claire's throat tightened. She thought of her mother, who used to say that pain made even the wild brave, because it left them with nothing to lose. She thought of her father sitting alone in his kitchen, waiting for Claire to arrive with groceries and a too bright smile. She thought of how many beings suffered quietly just out of sight, and how rare it was to be invited into their survival. After a minute, the bleeding slowed. The bobcat's breathing became less ragged. It shifted its paws and lifted its head. Claire leaned back, giving space, because recovery began with freedom. The bobcat rose slowly. For a moment, it stood unsteady, as if testing whether the world still hurt. Then it took one step, then another, and the limp was still there, but less desperate, less collapsing. The head turned toward Claire, eyes catching hers for a second that felt longer than seconds should be. Claire did not move. She did not reach out. She only nodded once, the way people nod at each other when words are too small. The bobcat backed away into the brush, paused again as if memorizing the shape of the car and the woman beside it, then disappeared into the trees with a steadier gait than before. The woods swallowed it like a secret. Claire remained standing on the shoulder, gloves still on, heart still racing, as if she had stepped into a story no one would believe at the dinner table. Her hands shook when she returned to the driver's seat. She sat there with the engine idling, staring at the place the bobcat had vanished, and only then did she realize her cheeks were wet. She drove the rest of the way to her father's house with a silence that felt heavy and holy. The wire in the plastic container sat in the cup holder like evidence from a crime scene. Every few miles she glanced at it, anger rising and falling like a tide. Someone had left that thing in the woods. Someone had set it, or dropped it, or forgotten it, and an animal had paid for it in blood. By the time Claire pulled into her father's gravel driveway, dusk was staining the snowless yard purple. Her father, Earl, stood on the porch wrapped in an old flannel coat, his thin hair ruffled by the wind. He lifted a hand in greeting, then frowned at her expression. Claire carried the groceries inside, set them down, and told him what happened while she put the kettle on, her voice moving fast as if speed could outrun emotion. She described the bobcat, the paw on the glass, the wire, the way the animal had held still like it understood. Earl listened without interrupting, his face drawn tight, his eyes fixed not on Claire but on something far behind her story. as if the words had opened a door to a room he had kept locked. When she finished, she reached for the plastic container and placed it on the kitchen table. The wire clinked softly against the lid. Earl stared at it as if it might bite him. "That looks like snare wire," he said finally, voice hoarse. Claire's anger sharpened. "Then somebody out there is setting snares illegally. That cat could have died." Earl swallowed, and something shifted in his expression. Not denial, not surprise, but guilt that had been waiting for a reason to surface. He reached for the container but did not touch it, as if his hands were suddenly too heavy. "Claire," he said, and his voice cracked on her name. "Years ago, when money was tight, I did some things I'm not proud of." The kettle began to hiss, but neither of them moved. Earl stared at the wire. "I used snares, a few, not for sport, not because I liked it, because the mill cut hours and your mama was pregnant and the pantry was thin. I told myself it was just rabbits, just enough to get by." Claire felt the room tilt, her stomach dropping as if the floor had shifted under her feet. Her mind flashed to childhood dinners, venison stew when times were hard, the way her mother's smile sometimes looked too tired. Earl's eyes glistened. "I stopped. I swore I stopped. I went out and pulled what I could find. But the woods keep what you lose. And now you're telling me a bobcat had wire in its belly. And I can't help thinking." His voice broke again. "What if it was mine?" Claire's anger, so ready to burn, faltered in the face of her father's shame. She saw not a villain, but an old man carrying a past he wished he could scrub clean. She saw the truth elders understood too well. Sometimes good people made desperate choices, and the consequences did not always end when the need ended. Claire turned off the kettle, hands trembling, and sat across from him. The kitchen light made the lines on Earl's face look deeper, like riverbeds carved by years. "If it was yours," Claire said slowly, choosing each word like a careful step, "then we don't sit here and drown in guilt. We fix what can still be fixed." Earl blinked. "Fix it how?" Claire's mind returned to the bobcat's eyes, that long look before it vanished, and she felt something settle inside her, solid as a promise. "We go out," she said. "We find every bit of wire out there. We pull it, we clean it. We make sure nothing else suffers because of something left behind." Earl's shoulders sagged, relief and fear mixing in his posture. "I don't know if I can remember where." Claire reached across the table and covered his hand with her gloved one, leather against skin. "Then there'll be 2 sets of eyes," she said, "and 2 hearts that don't want this to happen again." The next morning, with frost on the grass and the sun pale as a coin, Claire and Earl walked the edge of the property and the tree line beyond. Earl carried an old walking stick. Claire carried a pair of heavy cutters, thick gloves, a bright orange flagging tape to mark hazards, and a small trash bag for every piece of metal they could remove. It was slow work, the kind that demanded patience and humility. Earl's breath came hard in the cold air. Claire's back ached from bending. They found rusted hooks and broken fence staples and a length of wire twisted like a thorny vine. They found 2 old snares Earl had missed, half buried under leaves, the loop still shaped to catch a neck that would never understand the trap. Each time they found one, Earl's face tightened, and Claire felt the weight of history in her hands as she cut and collected and stuffed it into the bag. There was no dramatic music, no applause, only the quiet dignity of cleaning up what could still be cleaned. On the 3rd day, they went farther following an old logging path Earl remembered from decades ago. The woods opened into a shallow clearing where deer tracks stitched the mud like handwriting. Claire moved slowly, scanning the ground the way her mother taught her, looking for the unnatural lines that did not belong. That was when she saw the bobcat again. It stood at the edge of the clearing, half-shadowed, coat blending with the brush. For a second, Claire wondered if her mind had conjured it from hope. But then the animal stepped forward, and she saw the slight weakness in its side, still healing, but improved. Claire froze. Earl stopped beside her, leaning on his stick. The bobcat did not approach the way it had on the road. This time it kept distance, wildness intact, but it did something that made Claire's breath catch. It lifted its head and gave a short, low, chirruping call. Not a roar, not a hiss, but a sound that carried through the clearing like a signal. Then it turned and walked a few steps, paused, and looked back. Claire's heart hammered. Earl's grip tightened on the stick. "It wants you to follow," Earl whispered, awe and fear mingling in his voice like two rivers meeting. Claire knew the rule, the sensible rule. Do not follow wildlife. Do not intrude. Do not turn an animal's life into a human adventure. But she also knew what she had learned on the road, the lesson that had entered her bones. Wild animals did not seek people unless the need was real. Claire moved slowly, not chasing, simply walking at a respectful distance as the bobcat led them along the edge of the clearing into thicker brush. It stopped again, waited, then continued, careful not to disappear completely, as if ensuring they could keep it in sight. After several minutes, it led them to a fallen log near a patch of tangled vines. The bobcat paused, then sat, ears swiveling, eyes on Claire. And then, from behind the log, there was movement. Two small shapes, then a third, tumbled out like shadows learning to be solid. Kittens. Bobcat kittens, their coats spotted like sunlight through leaves, their legs still too clumsy for their confidence. They wobbled, then pounced on each other, then paused to stare at the humans with wide, curious eyes. Claire's chest tightened so hard it hurt. The adult bobcat rose and stepped between the kittens and the humans. Not aggressive, but protective in the way every mother in every species understood. The kittens huddled close to her legs, then peeked around her like shy children behind a parent's skirt. Claire suddenly understood the plot twist life had been saving for her. This bobcat had not walked to her car simply to save itself. It had walked to her car because it had babies somewhere in the woods, and its own survival was tied to theirs. It had been running out of time, running out of strength, and if infection took it, the kittens would follow one by one, quiet and unseen. Another tragedy swallowed by the trees. Claire's eyes stung. She did not step closer. She did not reach out. She only lowered herself slowly onto one knee, making her body small, and whispered, "You did it. You made it back." The bobcat's gaze held hers, steady and dark, and in that gaze, Claire felt something that looked startlingly like gratitude. Not the human kind with words and hugs, but the wild kind that said, "The debt is noted, the danger is remembered, the mercy mattered." Earl's breath shuddered. Claire heard him whisper, barely audible, "Lord, forgive me." The bobcat turned its head and nudged one kitten gently, guiding it back toward the log. The kittens followed, tumbling and stumbling, then vanishing into the safety of brush and shadow. The mother bobcat lingered a heartbeat longer, then stepped backward, paused, and lowered its head once in a small, unmistakable bow of acknowledgement before it too disappeared. Claire remained kneeling, tears slipping down her cheeks, not from sadness alone, but from the overwhelming weight of what could have happened and did not. She thought of the wire in that cat's body, and she thought of the kittens who would have waited for a mother that never returned, and she felt the fierce, trembling relief of a disaster narrowly avoided. On the walk back, Earl's steps were slow, but his shoulders looked lighter, as if something inside him had finally shifted from shame to responsibility. He did not speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was quiet. "I never thought," Earl said, "that something I did to survive could come back to hurt something else decades later." Claire nodded, careful with her words because she knew elders did not need lectures, only honesty. "A lot of people never think that far," she said. "But thinking now is what matters." That afternoon, Claire did what her mother would have done. She drove to the nearest town office where a wildlife bulletin board hung near the entrance, and she asked about local conservation groups, trap removal programs, and safe ways to report illegal snares. She wrote down numbers. She learned which agency covered that county and how to contact a wildlife rehabilitator with proper permits. She did not tell the story like a boast. She told it like a warning wrapped in hope. She explained that wild animals rarely approach humans unless desperate, and that helping should always be done with safety and respect, and whenever possible with professionals. She explained that old wire and forgotten traps did not just rust away into harmlessness. They waited. Over the next weeks, Earl and Claire organized a small cleanup, quietly at first, then with more neighbors when word spread. Farmers brought gloves. Teenagers brought trash bags. A retired game warden showed up with tools and knowledge, not to shame Earl, but to guide everyone in doing it properly. They walked fence lines and creek beds and the edges of the pines, collecting what did not belong, removing hazards one piece at a time. Claire's father moved slowly, but he showed up every day he could, his walking stick tapping the earth like a metronome of penance. Sometimes he looked toward the woods with a sorrowful tenderness, as if hoping the mother bobcat might see him and understand that he was trying. One late afternoon, weeks after the roadside rescue, Claire drove the same rural road again, the sun low and golden, the world quiet. She did not expect anything. Life, after all, did not usually hand out neat endings. But as she rounded the bend near the spot where she had stopped, she saw a shape on the shoulder. Her foot eased off the gas, heart quickening. And there it was. The bobcat. Standing at a distance this time, healthy enough to be cautious, wild enough to keep its space. Claire stopped the car, stayed inside, and simply watched. The bobcat looked at her for a long moment, then turned its head toward the trees, where two kittens, bigger now, stronger, their ears tufted like their mother's, peeked out from the brush. They were alive. They were growing. They were learning the world with a mother who had survived long enough to teach them. The bobcat took a step back, then another, as if showing them without words the kind of creature a human could be when it chose to be gentle. The kittens stared, curious and cautious, then retreated behind their mother's legs. Claire did not move. She did not wave. She did not try to capture it with a phone camera, because some moments were meant to be held only in the heart. The bobcat dipped its head once, the smallest gesture, and then, with the kittens following like little shadows, it slipped into the trees and vanished. Claire sat there with her hands on the wheel, trembling, and laughed softly through tears because the feeling was too big for any single emotion. It was grief for what almost happened, gratitude for what did happen, and the quiet astonishment of being trusted by something that owed humans nothing. When she finally drove away, the road felt different, not safer exactly, but more awake. Claire understood now that every soda can tossed from a window, every loop of wire left behind, every careless human choice could ripple into the lives of creatures that could not complain, could not call for help, could only endure. And yet she also understood the other truth, the heartwarming one that had waited at the end of a heart-wrenching beginning. One calm person, one careful choice, one moment of steady hands and respect for a wild life, could ripple too. That night, Claire sat at Earl's kitchen table while he dozed in his chair, and she opened a notebook. She wrote down the phone numbers of rehabilitators, the guidelines for safe wildlife encounters, the names of neighbors who volunteered, and the dates of cleanup days. She wrote it all in large, clear letters that an older man could read without squinting, because she knew this effort would outlast her own adrenaline. Outside, somewhere beyond the porch light's reach, a mother bobcat moved through the pines with her kittens trailing behind, their paws silent on the earth, their bellies full enough, their future still uncertain but no longer doomed by a piece of forgotten wire. And in that quiet, in that unseen continuation, was the truest kind of thanks. Not a trophy, not a headline, but a life that went on, and a human heart that learned to be worthy of the wild trust it had been given.